The digital clock on Arthur's desk glared an unforgiving, neon red, 3:14 a.m. Arthur stared at the glowing numerals until they began to blur, his eyes burning with the gritty, friction-heavy sensation of too much screen time and too little rest. Before him on the dual monitors were the half-finished CAD blueprints for a commercial plaza, a freelance project that was currently 3 weeks behind schedule. He reached out blindly for his mug, bringing it to his lips only to find the coffee inside had gone cold hours ago, leaving a bitter, metallic sludge on his tongue. He rubbed his face with both hands, listening to the quiet, settling groans of the old house he rented on the edge of town. It was a drafty, 2-story colonial that always felt a few degrees colder on the inside than it was on the outside. Right now, it was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic humming of the refrigerator downstairs and the wind rattling the loose window panes in the study. Arthur desperately needed to sleep. His brain felt like it was packed with wet cotton, his thoughts moving sluggishly, snagging on the simplest problems. But looking toward the hallway that led to his bedroom, a cold knot of pure dread tightened in his stomach. Sleep was no longer a refuge for him, it was a trap. For the past 3 months, the sleep paralysis had evolved from an occasional, stress-induced nuisance into a nightly torment. Medical websites and his overworked general practitioner had explained it away easily enough: hypnagogic paralysis. A simple miscommunication in the brain. When a person enters REM sleep, the brain paralyzes the body to prevent them from acting out their dreams. In Arthur's case, his exhausted, anxiety-riddled brain was waking up before his body did. He was conscious, aware of his surroundings, but locked inside a flesh prison, completely immobile. That was the science of it. The science was rational. It was neat and tidy. The science, however, did not account for the visitor. Arthur sighed, his breath trembling slightly in the quiet room. He couldn't put it off any longer. If he didn't sleep, his heart was going to give out from the sheer volume of caffeine and adrenaline pumping through his veins. He saved his files, shut down the monitors, and plunged the study into darkness. The walk down the short hallway to his bedroom felt like a death march. He stripped off his clothes, leaving them in a messy pile on the floor, and collapsed onto the mattress. The sheets were cold. He pulled the heavy duvet up to his chin, lying flat on his back, a position he knew made the paralysis more likely, but his exhausted muscles refused to let him turn over. He closed his eyes. "It's just a chemical misfire," he repeated to himself, a desperate mantra. Serotonin and melatonin. Misfiring synapses. None of it is real. For a few blissful minutes, he drifted. The heavy, leaden weight of sleep began to pull him under. The sharp edges of his anxiety softened, melting away into the comforting void of unconsciousness. He was standing on the edge of a dream, about to step in. Then, the buzzing started. It always started with the buzzing. It was a low, vibrational hum that originated at the base of his skull, vibrating against his spine like a tuning fork. Arthur's consciousness snapped to attention, but it was too late. The trap had sprung. "No, no, no, wake up. Move your hand. Just move one finger," his inner voice screamed. He sent the desperate command from his brain to his right index finger. Twitch. Nothing happened. He tried to turn his head. Frozen. He tried to open his mouth to gasp for air, to shout, to make any sound that might break the spell. His jaw remained clamped shut, heavy as stone. His eyes, however, snapped open. The bedroom was bathed in the pale, sickly glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, casting long, barred shadows across the floor. Arthur's breathing grew incredibly shallow. A crushing, suffocating weight settled directly over his sternum. It felt as though a solid block of concrete had been placed on his chest, restricting his lungs from expanding. He was suffocating, trapped in a body that was simulating death. The air in the room suddenly grew freezing cold. The ambient noises of the house, the wind, the hum of the fridge abruptly died, replaced by a dense, ringing silence. The static buzzing in his head grew louder, accompanied by a faint, wet sound from the darkest corner of the room, near the closet door. Schhhhk. 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 It sounded like bare skin dragging across the hardwood floor. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. It's a hallucination. The amygdala is in overdrive. It's a fear response. It's not real. It's not real. From the pitch-black shadows of the corner, the darkness began to coalesce. It detached itself from the wall, standing up in a slow, unnatural, unfolding motion. The entity was impossibly tall, its head grazing the ceiling. It had no discernible features, appearing as a three-dimensional void that seemed to consume the dim light around it. But its proportions were grotesque. Its torso was emaciated, practically skeletal, while its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with far too many fingers, elongated, spindly digits that twitched with a spider-like autonomy. The demon did not walk, it glided. It moved toward the foot of the bed with a juddering, frame-skipping motion, like a corrupted video file. Arthur screamed internally, thrashing against his paralyzed muscles until he felt like his brain would hemorrhage, but outwardly, he was perfectly still, eyes wide and fixed on the horror approaching him. The entity reached the foot of the bed. It stopped. Arthur could feel the mattress depress slightly under its weight. It's not real. Please, God, let me wake up. Slowly, agonizingly, the shadow figure began to crawl up the bed. It straddled Arthur's legs, its impossible weight pressing down, compounding the crushing sensation on his chest. It crawled closer, its spindly fingers sinking into the duvet. As it loomed over him, Arthur could see the faint texture of its form. It wasn't just a shadow, it was composed of something resembling swirling, black smoke, dense and freezing cold. It leaned down, bringing its faceless visage mere inches from Arthur's nose. The smell of ozone and damp, ancient earth filled Arthur's nostrils. The buzzing in his ears reached a deafening crescendo, a roaring static that threatened to rip his sanity to shreds. The entity raised one long, jagged finger and dragged it slowly down the side of Arthur's cheek. The touch was freezing, burning like dry ice. Arthur's survival instinct reached its absolute peak. With a final, explosive surge of sheer, terrified adrenaline, the neural block shattered. Arthur shot up in bed, gasping for air as if he had just breached the surface of a dark ocean. He threw himself back against the headboard, his hands gripping the sheets so tightly his knuckles were white. The room was empty. The crushing weight was gone. The temperature felt normal. There was only the pale light of the street lamp and the sound of his own ragged, hyperventilating breaths echoing in the quiet room. He sat there for a full 10 minutes, shivering uncontrollably, covered in a slick layer of cold sweat. His chest heaved as his heart rate slowly began to decelerate from a frantic sprint to a steady, exhausted pounding. "Just a dream," he whispered aloud, his voice raspy and weak. "Just a misfire. It's over." He rubbed his eyes, the adrenaline crash leaving him feeling nauseous and weak. His throat was parched, feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. Without taking his eyes off the dark corner where the shadow had first appeared, Arthur reached out blindly toward his nightstand, searching for the glass of water he always kept there. His hand fumbled in the dark, brushing past his alarm clock and his phone. Instead of the smooth glass, his fingertips brushed against something dry and textured. It felt like paper. Frowning, Arthur turned his head. He grabbed his phone and tapped the screen, illuminating the nightstand with a harsh, bright light. Sitting perfectly centered on the dark wood of the nightstand, right beside his water glass, was a bright yellow sticky note. Arthur froze. His breath caught in his throat. He lived alone. He hadn't brought any office supplies into the bedroom. He stared at the small, square piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. With a trembling hand, He reached out and picked it up. The texture of the paper was entirely mundane, a standard post-it note. But the writing on it sent a spike of pure ice straight into his veins. It wasn't written in ink. It looked like it had been violently scrawled with a piece of charred wood or a thick stick of charcoal. The letters were jagged, erratic, and pressed so hard into the paper that they nearly tore through the yellow surface. There were only 4 words, written in all capital letters. Lock the back door. Arthur's phone nearly slipped from his sweaty grasp. He read the words again. And again. I wrote this, his rational mind immediately supplied, desperate to maintain order. I was sleepwalking. People do crazy things when they're sleep deprived. Ambien makes people cook whole meals in their sleep. I just had a waking nightmare, got up, wrote this in a state of delirium, and went back to bed. It was the only logical explanation. It had to be. But as he sat there in the dark, the silence of the house suddenly felt entirely different. It no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. Lock the back door. Arthur swallowed hard. He slowly pushed the duvet off his legs and swung his feet onto the hardwood floor. He grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight app. The harsh white beam cut through the gloom of the bedroom. He stood up, his legs feeling like jelly, and stepped out into the hallway. The house was completely dark. The wooden floorboards, which usually offered a comforting, familiar creak, now sounded like warning alarms under his bare feet. He walked slowly, leading with the beam of his flashlight, scanning the top of the stairs, the guest bathroom, the empty space above the foyer. Nothing. He gripped the wooden banister, his knuckles white, and began the descent to the first floor. Every shadow cast by the banister spindle seemed to elongate and reach for him. The memory of the shadow entity, its impossible height, its freezing touch flashed in his mind's eye. He reached the bottom of the stairs. The living room to his left was undisturbed. The television was a dark mirror. The cushions on the sofa were perfectly arranged. He turned right, moving toward the kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen floor was tiled, and the cold bit into the soles of his feet. He swept the flashlight beam across the countertops, the stove, the refrigerator. Everything was exactly as he had left it. Arthur let out a long, shaky breath. He felt foolish. He was a grown man, a professional, creeping around his own house in the middle of the night because of a bad dream and a misplaced piece of stationery. He shook his head, a weary, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. He lowered the flashlight. As the beam dropped, it illuminated the far end of the kitchen. Arthur stopped dead. The smile vanished. The back door, a heavy, solid oak door that led out to the small, fenced-in yard, was not secured. In fact, it wasn't even closed. It was standing wide open, a gaping black rectangle leading out into the night. Arthur stared in paralyzed horror as a cold night breeze drifted through the opening, gently rattling the vertical blinds hanging over the adjacent window. The wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and dead leaves into the kitchen. He hadn't opened that door in days. He had checked the deadbolt before he went upstairs to work that evening. He was meticulous about it. He knew it had been locked. Arthur didn't breathe. He kept the flashlight trained on the dark opening, half expecting someone or something to step out from the darkness of the yard into the light. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical pressure in the room. Moving with agonizing slowness, terrified that any sudden noise would draw attention, Arthur crept forward. He reached the door frame. He peeked his head outside, shining the light into the yard. There was nothing but overgrown grass and the rustling leaves of the old oak tree near the fence line. He grabbed the heavy brass handle, pulled the door shut with a quiet, solid thud, and engaged the deadbolt with a loud click. He then turned the chain lock, securing it in place. He backed away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs once again, matching the frantic rhythm from his waking nightmare. He looked down at his left hand. He was still clutching the yellow sticky note, the charcoal letters smudged against his sweaty thumb. Lock the back door. Arthur leaned back against the kitchen island, his eyes darting frantically around the dark, quiet house. He was completely alone. But as he looked at the jagged writing, a horrifying realization began to dawn on him, settling like a stone in his gut. The sleep paralysis demon hadn't come to terrorize him tonight. It had come to warn him. Morning sunlight is supposed to banish the terrors of the night, but for Arthur, the pale, gray dawn only illuminated his descending madness. He sat at his kitchen island, a mug of black coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at the yellow sticky note resting on the granite countertop. Lock the back door. The charcoal letters seemed to mock him in the daylight. He had spent the remainder of the night sitting upright in a hard-backed wooden chair, a baseball bat resting across his knees, listening to the house settle. He had scoured the internet for hours on his phone, frantically typing queries into the search bar. Can sleepwalkers unlock doors? Dissociative fugue state symptoms. Hallucinations leaving physical objects. The medical forums offered the same sterile comfort they always did. Severe stress, sleep deprivation, and high caffeine intake could trigger complex parasomnias. People had been known to cook, drive, and even write emails while technically asleep. It was highly probable, the article suggested, that Arthur had experienced a hypnagogic hallucination, panicked, walked downstairs in a twilight state, opened the door, written the note to himself, and then snapped out of it. "I am losing my mind," Arthur whispered to the empty kitchen. He rubbed the residual grit from his eyes and walked over to the back door. The deadbolt was still firmly engaged. He pressed his hand against the heavy oak wood. It felt solid, real, and undeniable. He had to accept the clinical explanation, the alternative that a 10-foot-tall shadow entity with spider-leg fingers was leaving him household reminders was a one-way ticket to a padded cell. Arthur decided to take control. He threw the sticky note into the trash, buried himself in his architectural blueprints for the next 14 hours, and deliberately exhausted himself to the point where his brain wouldn't have the energy to conjure phantoms. For 2 nights, the strategy seemed to work. He slept a dreamless, heavy sleep, waking up groggy but undisturbed. He began to convince himself that the backdoor incident was the climax of his stress, a psychological fever breaking. Then came Tuesday. Arthur awoke with a start. There was no buzzing this time, no glacial drop in temperature, and no crushing weight on his chest. He simply blinked, his eyes open to the morning light filtering through his blinds. He stretched, feeling a rare surge of optimism, and swung his legs out of bed. It was only when he walked into the master bathroom and flipped on the vanity lights that his blood ran cold. Stuck directly to the center of the bathroom mirror, obscuring his own pale reflection, was another yellow sticky note. Arthur stopped breathing. He hadn't bought sticky notes. He didn't even own charcoal. Yet, there it was, the jagged, furious handwriting pressing so hard into the paper that the yellow square was slightly warped. "Don't drink the milk." Arthur stared at it, his heart resuming the frantic, hammering rhythm he had come to dread. He stepped closer, examining the writing. There were faint, black smudges on the glass of the mirror around the edges of the paper, like fingerprints left by someone coated in soot. Instinctively, Arthur checked his own fingertips. They were perfectly clean. He ripped the note off the mirror, his hand shaking violently, and marched downstairs. He practically tore the refrigerator door off its hinges, grabbing the half-gallon plastic jug of milk from the top shelf. The expiration date clearly read that it was good for another 5 days. Arthur unscrewed the blue plastic cap and brought the opening to his nose. He violently recoiled, gagging. The smell was atrocious, a putrid, sour stench of severe bacterial rot that burned his nostrils. He poured a small amount into the sink. It didn't flow like liquid, it plopped out in thick, curdled, yellowish chunks. It was completely rancid. If he had poured that into his morning coffee and swallowed it, he would have been violently ill, potentially hospitalized given his already weakened state. He set the jug down on the counter, backing away from it. He looked at the note crumpled in his left hand. "Don't drink the milk." "Okay," Arthur breathed, his voice trembling. "Okay. What the hell is happening?" The terror began to morph into something far more complex. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was a morbid, terrifying bewilderment. The entity, whatever it was, a fracture in his psyche or a literal monster residing in his bedroom, wasn't trying to harm him. It was protecting him. The escalation continued 3 days later. Thursday afternoon brought a torrential downpour, the sky bruising a deep, violent purple. Arthur was pacing the upstairs hallway, trying to work out a structural flaw in the plaza's roof design, when he nearly tripped over something. He looked down. Sitting precisely in the center of the antique Persian runner rug that spanned the hallway was a third sticky note. Arthur didn't panic this time. A numb, detached resignation had settled over him. He knelt down and picked it up. "Move the rug." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy woven edge of the runner and hauled it backward, exposing the original oak floorboards beneath. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. But as Arthur looked closer, he noticed a dark discoloration seeping through the seams of the wood, directly over where the hallway passed above the downstairs utility room. He pressed the toe of his sneaker against the dark patch of wood. The floorboard didn't just creak, it squelched. The wood yielded under his foot like a wet sponge. Horrified, Arthur pressed harder, and the wood actually began to splinter and give way, revealing a gaping, rotting cavity beneath. A slow, insidious leak from an overhead pipe in the attic had been dripping down inside the walls for God knows how long, pooling directly under the floorboards and rotting the joists away completely. Arthur swallowed hard, staring into the dark hole. If he had been carrying a heavy box, or even just walking with a heavy footstep in the middle of the night, his leg would have punched straight through the floor, sending him crashing down into the ceiling of the utility room below. He could have broken his leg, or worse, severed an artery on the jagged wood. He looked at the note in his hand. "Move the rug." The entity knew the house better than he did. It knew about the unlocked door. It knew about the spoiled food. It knew about the rotting infrastructure. Arthur spent the rest of Thursday in a state of hyper-focused manic energy. He called a plumber and a carpenter, blocked off the hallway, and then drove to the nearest electronics store. If he was going crazy, he needed proof. If he wasn't going crazy, he needed a record. He purchased a high-definition, infrared night vision camera. When he got home, he mounted it on a tripod in the corner of his bedroom, angling the lens to capture the entirety of his bed and the closet door. He ran the feed directly into his laptop, setting it to record onto a massive external hard drive. Next, he went to a stationery store. He bought a pristine white, wire-bound notepad and a thick, chisel-tip black Sharpie marker. That night, Arthur didn't fight his exhaustion. He welcomed it. He changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants, turned on the camera, and verified the little red recording light was glowing steadily in the dark. He climbed into bed, lying flat on his back. He took the white notepad and wrote 3 words in large, block letters across the top page. "What are you?" He placed the notepad squarely on his chest, directly over his sternum. He uncapped the Sharpie, resting the thick black marker right next to the pad, his hand resting loosely beside it. "I am baiting a monster," he thought, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in the back of his throat. "I am leaving a guest book for my sleep paralysis demon." He closed his eyes. He focused on his breathing, letting the rhythm slow his racing heart. He waited for the trap to spring. It took 2 hours. Arthur was hovering in the liminal space between waking and sleeping when the change occurred. It was immediate and violent. The ambient sound of the rain lashing against his window abruptly cut out, replaced by a deafening, localized static that roared in his ears. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath suddenly pluming in the dark air. He tried to gasp, but his lungs were locked. His limbs were encased in invisible concrete. The paralysis had him. His eyes snapped open. The entity was already there. It hadn't emerged from the corner this time. It was standing directly beside his bed, a towering monolith of writhing, freezing darkness. It was so close Arthur could see the edges of its form, like smoke swirling violently within a glass container. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, but Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of scrutiny, a heavy, oppressive gaze boring down into his soul. Arthur couldn't thrash. He couldn't scream. He could only stare in wide-eyed terror as the entity slowly raised its arm. The arm was disproportionately long, snapping at the joints with awful, jerky movements. The hand that descended toward Arthur's chest was a nightmare of anatomy, 7 or 8 elongated, jointed fingers that ended in sharp, jagged points. "It's going to crush my heart," Arthur panicked, his mind screaming against the chemical lock on his body. "It's going to rip my chest open." The entity's hand hovered over Arthur's chest. The freezing aura radiating from it seeped through Arthur's t-shirt, raising goosebumps on his skin. But it didn't touch him. Instead, 2 of those impossible, spindly fingers delicately pinched the thick black sharpie resting on his chest. Arthur watched, his reality fracturing completely, as the shadow demon picked up the marker. The entity adjusted its grip, the long fingers wrapping awkwardly around the plastic cylinder. Then, it leaned over him. The sheer size of it blocked out the infrared light of the camera across the room. Arthur was engulfed in absolute darkness, the smell of ozone and wet earth suffocating him. He felt the slight pressure on his chest as the entity pressed the marker to the notepad. Squeak. Scritch. Squeak. The sound of the thick marker dragging across the paper was the loudest thing in the world. It was a harsh, physical sound, completely at odds with the ethereal, smoke-like nature of the creature holding it. Arthur felt every stroke vibrate through the cardboard backing of the notepad and into his breastbone. It was writing slowly, methodically. Each stroke felt deliberate, heavy with purpose. Scritch. Squeak. Arthur's vision began to blur from the lack of oxygen, his locked lungs burning for a deep breath. Just as he felt he was about to pass out, the pressure vanished. The marker clattered onto the hardwood floor by the side of the bed. The entity stood up to its full, terrifying height. It lingered for a fraction of a second, its faceless visage turned toward the red light of the recording camera. Then, the static snapped off. The paralysis broke instantly. Arthur gasped violently, sucking in massive lungfuls of air, his body arching off the mattress as control returned to his muscles. He threw himself sideways, scrambling frantically against the wall, putting as much distance between himself and the side of the bed as possible. He reached out and slammed his hand against the wall switch, flooding the bedroom with harsh, yellow light. The room was empty. The temperature was normalizing. Outside, the rain was still beating against the glass. Arthur stayed pressed against the wall for a long time, his chest heaving, listening to the desperate thumping of his own heart. Slowly, his eyes drifted down to the bed. The white notepad was still sitting there, resting exactly where it had been on the crumpled duvet. Trembling so hard his teeth chattered, Arthur slid off the bed and approached it. He picked up the notepad. The ink from the Sharpie was thick, wet, and smelled strongly of alcohol solvent. Beneath his neat, block-lettered question "What are you?" were 3 new words. They were written in a jagged, violent scrawl, tearing slightly into the paper, identical to the charcoal notes. "Your night watchman." Arthur stared at the words until they lost all meaning. He didn't drop the pad. He didn't scream. He walked over to his laptop, his movements stiff and robotic. He hit the spacebar to wake the screen and pulled up the camera feed he had been recording. He scrubbed through the footage, watching the green-tinted infrared video of himself sleeping. He found the timestamp corresponding to 10 minutes ago. On the screen, Arthur saw himself lying perfectly still. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the video feed violently glitched. Thick bands of digital static tore across the screen, distorting the image. The audio track erupted into a horrific screech of white noise. Through the heavy digital corruption, Arthur could faintly make out his own sleeping form. And right beside his bed, blocking out half the frame, was a towering column of absolute, unreadable blackness, bending over his chest. The footage glitched again, returning to crystal clear night vision. Arthur on the screen suddenly gasped and scrambled backward against the wall. Arthur closed the laptop. He looked back at the notepad in his hand, tracing the thick, black ink of the word Watchman with his thumb. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't hallucinating. The monster was real. But as Arthur stood in the silent, empty room, a terrifying new thought crept into his mind, chilling him deeper than the entity's touch ever could. If this horrifying, impossible creature felt the need to act as a guard dog, what exactly was it protecting him from? The human mind is a remarkably adaptable machine. It is designed to normalize the abnormal, to build callous over raw trauma, and to find equilibrium in the most terrifying of circumstances. If you are exposed to a monster long enough, and the monster does not bare its teeth, it eventually just becomes a piece of the furniture. For Arthur, the transition from absolute, mind-shattering terror to a bizarre, Stockholm-esque acceptance took exactly 14 days. The first few nights following the revelation of the Night Watchman, Arthur didn't sleep in his bedroom. He camped out on the living room sofa with all the lights blazing, the television volume turned up to a low hum, and the baseball bat resting against his thigh. He waited for the cold. He waited for the towering shadow to descend the stairs. It never came. The entity, it seemed, was bound to the parameters of the sleep paralysis. It only existed in the liminal space between Arthur's waking consciousness and his REM sleep. It required the biological glitch of his paralyzed body to manifest its impossible geometry into the physical world. By the second week, exhaustion forced Arthur back into his bed. He couldn't keep living on the sofa. His freelance architectural work was suffering, his lines sloppy and his structural calculations riddled with careless errors. He needed deep, restorative sleep. So, he established a routine. It was the only way his hyper-rational brain could cope with the supernatural reality he was trapped in. Every night at 11:30 p.m., Arthur locked the front and back doors, physically rattling the handles to ensure the deadbolts were thrown. He checked the stove. He checked the windows. Then, he went to his bedroom, set the infrared camera on its tripod, and placed the white wire-bound notepad and the thick black Sharpie on his nightstand. He no longer left the pad on his chest. That felt too intimate, too vulnerable. Leaving it on the nightstand was a compromise and offering to a terrifying roommate. When the paralysis came, Arthur forced himself to change his reaction. Instead of fighting the chemical lock, instead of thrashing internally and spiking his heart rate, he leaned into it. When the buzzing started at the base of his skull, he visualized a heavy, warm blanket settling over him. When the room's temperature plummeted, freezing his breath in the air, he kept his eyes open but softened his focus. The Watchman always appeared. It would unfold from the ink-black shadows of the corner, its towering, emaciated frame gliding across the hardwood floor with that sickening, stuttering motion. It would stand at the foot of his bed, its impossibly long arms hanging limp, its faceless visage staring down at him. But Arthur stopped screaming internally. He just watched it back. It was horrifying to look at a twisting column of freezing, localized void that defied physics, but it never made a hostile move. It never reached for his throat. Some nights, it would simply stand guard at the foot of the bed until the paralysis faded. Other nights, Arthur would hear the heavy squeak of the Sharpie on paper, and in the morning, a new note would be waiting. They were never conversational. The Watchman was strictly utilitarian. Stove is on. Arthur had left a burner simmering on low. Replace the battery. The carbon monoxide detector in the hallway was dead. Arthur began to view the entity not as a demon, but as a symbiotic parasite. A supernatural guard dog born from the depths of his own severe anxiety, manifesting to protect its host. He stopped dreading the night. Paradoxically, the presence of a 10-foot-tall shadow monster became the only thing that allowed him to sleep deeply. If the watchman was standing at the foot of the bed, it meant the perimeter was secure. Arthur was safe. But as Arthur's fear of the supernatural faded, a new, entirely mundane paranoia began to take root. It started in the third week of April, as the spring weather turned humid and stifling. The house began to feel wrong. Not haunted, but disturbed. It was the little things. Things so microscopic that Arthur initially dismissed them as byproducts of his own distracted, overworked mind. He would leave his keys on the kitchen island, he would find them on the entryway console. He bought a 6-pack of sparkling water, drank 2, and the next day there were only 3 left in the fridge. He would notice the faint, metallic scent of unwashed pennies in the upstairs hallway, a smell that wasn't ozone or damp earth, but sweat and old clothes. Arthur blamed his memory. He was working 60-hour weeks trying to finish the plaza blueprints. He was stressed. He was misplacing things. He checked the infrared camera footage obsessively every morning, but the camera only recorded his bedroom. The frame only showed Arthur sleeping, the occasional manifestation of the watchman, and the static of the night. Nothing else. The rest of the house was a blind spot. One Tuesday evening, Arthur was standing in the kitchen, staring at a half-eaten sleeve of crackers on the counter. He distinctly remembered putting a chip clip on it and placing it in the pantry the night before. Now, it was out, the plastic torn, crumbs scattered across the granite. A cold prickle of unease washed over his scalp. He looked toward the ceiling. The old colonial house had a crawl-space attic, accessible only by a small, square wooden hatch in the ceiling of the walk-in closet in the guest bedroom. No, Arthur told himself, rubbing his temples. Don't do this. You have a literal shadow demon watching over you at night. You don't need to invent human intruders too. He threw the crackers in the trash, double-checked the dead bolts, and went up to bed. The night was oppressive. The air conditioning was struggling against an early, unseasonal heat wave, leaving the bedroom thick and stagnant. Arthur lay on top of the sheets, dressed only in boxers, sweating lightly. He placed the notepad and Sharpie on the nightstand, turned on the camera, and closed his eyes. He drifted off quickly, his exhaustion pulling him down like a lead weight. He didn't know how much time had passed when the shift occurred, but the transition was brutally violent. There was no slow build-up of static. There was no gradual drop in temperature. Arthur was suddenly and forcefully ripped from his REM sleep into full consciousness, his body slamming into the chemical paralysis like a car hitting a brick wall. His eyes snapped open. The room was freezing. Not the usual, chilling drop in temperature, but an agonizing, biting cold that frosted the edges of the window panes. The buzzing in his head wasn't a low hum, it was a deafening, metallic shriek, like train brakes grinding against steel tracks. Arthur's heart exploded in his chest, hammering against his ribs with a force that actually caused physical pain. He tried to swallow, but his throat was locked tight. Panic, pure, undiluted, primal panic flooded his system. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. The watchman was already there, but it wasn't standing at the foot of the bed. It was positioned directly beside Arthur, hovering over the nightstand. And it was completely losing its mind. The entity was glitching violently. Its towering form flickered and distorted, tearing at the edges like a signal losing its broadcast. It wasn't gliding, it was twitching in erratic, jagged bursts of motion. The long, impossible arms were flailing silently, snapping at the joints. Arthur had never seen it act like this. The watchman had always been a monolith of calm, oppressive stillness. Tonight, the demon was radiating absolute, undeniable terror. "What is it?" Arthur screamed in his mind, his eyes wide, tracking the creature's chaotic movements. "What's wrong?" The watchman suddenly snapped its head toward the far side of the room. It raised one of its massive, spindly arms and pointed directly at Arthur's bedroom closet. The closet was built into the wall, featuring double wooden louvered doors with horizontal slats. In the dim light of the street lamp outside, the dark gaps between the slats looked like rows of missing teeth. The watchman pointed its trembling, jagged fingers at the doors. Then, it pointed back down at Arthur. Then back at the closet. It was frantic, desperate. The static in Arthur's head pitched higher, a localized siren of warning. The entity lunged toward the nightstand. It didn't delicately pick up the sharpie this time. It slammed its monstrous hand down, grabbing the marker so violently that it knocked the water glass onto the floor. The glass shattered with a loud, ringing crash that echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. Arthur couldn't flinch. He lay completely paralyzed as the shadow demon brought the marker down onto the notepad. The writing wasn't slow or methodical. It was a furious, violent slashing. The entity bore down on the paper with so much force that Arthur could hear the thick cardboard backing of the notepad tearing. The heavy squeak of the marker was replaced by the sound of ripping paper and snapping plastic. The watchman finished its frantic scrawl. It didn't set the pen down. It dropped the crushed remains of the sharpie, ripped the top sheet of paper from the wire binding, and leaned directly over Arthur. The freezing void of its face hovered an inch from Arthur's nose. The cold was so intense Arthur felt his eyelashes crystallize. With a jerky, panicked motion, the watchman slammed the ripped piece of paper directly onto Arthur's face, covering his eyes and nose. The physical impact, combined with the sheer, overwhelming terror radiating from the entity, shattered the hypnagogic lock in an instant. Arthur's body snapped back online. He gasped, a massive, tearing intake of air, and violently convulsed upward. He scrambled backward against the headboard, his hands flying to his face to claw the paper away. The supernatural cold vanished instantly. The deafening static cut out. The room was immediately plunged back into the stifling, humid heat of the summer night. The watchman was gone, dissolved back into the mundane shadows. Arthur sat pressed against the wall, hyperventilating, his entire body shaking so violently his teeth rattled. He clutched the crumpled piece of paper in his fist. His bedside lamp was just an arm's length away. He reached out, his hand trembling wildly, and clicked the switch. The yellow bulb flared to life, illuminating the bedroom. The shattered remains of his water glass glistened on the hardwood floor. Arthur looked down at the piece of paper in his shaking hand. The thick black ink was smeared, bleeding through the torn fibers of the page. The words were written so aggressively they had carved deep grooves into the paper. There were only 4 words. "He is already inside." Arthur's breath hitched. He stared at the word he. Not it. Not they. He. The blood drained entirely from Arthur's face, leaving him pale and sick. The creeping paranoia of the past 2 weeks, the missing food, the moved keys, the smell of unwashed clothes all snapped together into a horrifying, crystal clear picture. The watchman wasn't warning him about a supernatural threat. It wasn't protecting him from ghosts or demons. The monster under his bed was warning him about the monster in his house. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the bedroom. The only sound was the ragged, rapid intake of Arthur's own breathing. He sat perfectly still on the bed, his eyes slowly, agonizingly dragging themselves away from the note and looking across the room. He stared at the double louvered doors of his closet. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Arthur tried to convince himself that the watchman was wrong. That it was just a final, cruel trick of his own fractured psyche. Then, the silence broke. From behind the wooden slats of the closet doors, barely 10 feet away from where Arthur sat, came a sound that made his soul detach from his body. It was a slow, wet inhalation of air. Heavy. Labored. Human. H. The breathing stopped. Then, Arthur heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of weight shifting on the floorboards inside the narrow space. A shoe scuffed against the wood. Arthur sat frozen in the yellow light of his bedside lamp. He was no longer paralyzed by a chemical misfire in his brain. He was paralyzed by the very real, waking realization that he was locked in a bedroom with a man who had been secretly living in his house, watching him, eating his food, roaming his halls while he slept. And now, the man knew Arthur was awake. Very slowly, the brass handle of the right closet door began to turn. The brass knob of the closet door turned with an agonizingly slow, metallic grind. To Arthur, sitting frozen against his headboard under the harsh yellow glare of the bedside lamp, the sound was louder than a collapsing building. The louvered door clicked open. It didn't swing wide immediately, it hung ajar by a mere inch. From that narrow, pitch-black fissure, a smell seeped out into the bedroom. It was the scent Arthur had been ignoring for weeks, now concentrated and overpowering, a nauseating cocktail of stale sweat, unwashed hair, urine, and the dusty, suffocating odor of fiberglass insulation from the attic. Arthur's vocal cords were paralyzed, not by the hypnagogic glitch of his brain, but by sheer, primal terror. His eyes were wide, fixed on that black inch of space. A hand emerged. It was a human hand, but it looked almost as alien as the watchman's. The skin was smeared with gray soot and dirt, the fingernails long, cracked, and caked with dark grime. The fingers curled around the edge of the wooden door, the knuckles white with tension. Slowly, the door was pushed open. The man who stepped out of the closet looked like a walking corpse. He was violently emaciated, his clothes hanging off his gaunt frame in filthy, tattered rags. He wore a faded, oversized flannel shirt that was stained with dark patches, and jeans frayed at the hems. His hair was a matted, greasy bird's nest that hung over his eyes, but it couldn't hide the manic, feverish intensity burning in his pupils. His skin was deathly pale, the kind of pallor that only comes from weeks spent living out of the sun, hidden away in crawl spaces and floorboards. In his right hand, gripped so tightly his arm trembled, was an 8-inch chef's knife. Arthur recognized it instantly. It was from the butcher block in his own kitchen downstairs. The man didn't rush him. He stepped out of the closet and just stood there, his chest heaving with heavy, whistling breaths. His eyes darted around the bedroom, lingering for a fraction of a second on the shattered water glass, the torn sticky note on the bed, and the red recording light of the infrared camera in the corner. Then, his gaze snapped to Arthur. A terrible, broken smile stretched across the man's cracked lips, revealing yellowed teeth. "You're awake," the man rasped. His voice was a dry, grating whisper, the sound of vocal cords that hadn't been used for conversation in a very long time. "You're not supposed to be awake yet." Arthur's mouth opened, but only a pathetic, breathless squeak came out. He pressed his back harder against the wall, his hands scrambling blindly over the sheets, looking for anything, a weapon, his phone, a way out. "I tried to be quiet," the man continued, taking a slow, shuffling step forward. The tip of the chef's knife dragged lightly against his thigh. "I really did. But you keep changing things. You lock the doors I open. You throw away the milk I fix for you. You put the rug back." The words hit Arthur like physical blows. The realization was a sickening free fall. The milk I fix for you. The intruder hadn't just been eating his food, he had been poisoning it, trying to weaken him, trying to make him sick. "Why?" Arthur finally choked out, his voice cracking violently. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head, a twitching, bird-like motion. "I live here, Artie. I live in the walls. I live in the hot dark at the top of the house. But it's too cramped. Too cramped. And you don't even appreciate all this space. You just sit at your desk. You just sleep. The man's smile vanished, replaced by a scowl of pure, unadulterated hatred. And you have, friends. Bad friends. The man looked nervously toward the dark corner of the room, the corner where the watchman usually manifested. He shuddered, a full-body tremor. I see the black smoke, the intruder whispered, his eyes wide with a sudden, superstitious terror. I peek through the air vents. I see it standing over you. I hate it. It makes the floor cold. It makes the air hurt. It leaves those stupid yellow papers. He looked back at Arthur, raising the knife so the blade caught the light of the lamp. I'm going to cut you, Artie. If you're dead, the cold thing will leave my house. The intruder lunged. Survival instinct, entirely divorced from conscious thought, hijacked Arthur's body. He grabbed the heavy, ceramic base of his bedside lamp and hurled it with all his might directly at the man's face. The lamp struck the intruder squarely in the shoulder with a loud crack, shattering into pieces and plunging the side of the room into immediate darkness. The impact threw the man off balance, sending him crashing into the nightstand. Arthur didn't wait to see if he fell. He scrambled across the mattress like a terrified animal, throwing himself off the left side of the bed. His bare feet hit the hardwood floor, slipping slightly on the shattered glass of the water cup, a sharp pain lancing through his heel. He ignored it. He bolted for the open bedroom door. Come back. The intruder shrieked, a sound completely devoid of sanity. It was the screech of a feral, cornered beast. Arthur sprinted into the hallway. The house was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint, ambient glow of the moon filtering through the windows. His heart was a jackhammer in his chest, his breath burning in his throat. He aimed for the stairs, knowing that if he could just get to the front door, he could throw the deadbolt and disappear into the street. But as he ran down the hallway, his panic caused a fatal miscalculation. He forgot about the rug. In his desperation to escape, Arthur's foot caught the heavy, rolled-up edge of the Persian runner he had pushed aside days ago to expose the rotting floorboards. His ankle twisted violently. He pitched forward, his arms flailing, and slammed hard into the hallway wall. The breath was knocked from his lungs in a sickening whoosh. Before he could regain his balance, a heavy, filthy weight slammed into his back. The intruder tackled him. They both went down in a tangle of limbs, crashing onto the hardwood just inches away from the exposed, rotting cavity in the floor. The smell of the man was overwhelming, suffocating and foul. Arthur gagged as a bony arm wrapped around his throat, cutting off his airway. He thrashed wildly, throwing elbows backward, connecting with ribs and bone. The intruder grunted but didn't let go, his grip possessed by the hysterical, frantic strength of the insane. Mine. The man screamed directly into Arthur's ear, spit flying onto his cheek. My house. Arthur felt the cold, hard steel of the chef's knife press against the side of his neck. The sharp edge bit into his skin, a stinging line of fire. Arthur grabbed the man's wrist with both hands, using every ounce of his remaining strength to push the blade away from his carotid artery. The two men rolled on the floor, a desperate, animalistic struggle in the dark. Arthur was bigger, but he was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and fueled only by fading adrenaline. The intruder was fighting with the relentless, unyielding leverage of absolute madness. They rolled again, and Arthur found himself pinned on his back. The intruder straddled his chest, his knees digging painfully into Arthur's biceps. The man raised the knife high above his head, holding it with both hands, the blade pointing directly downward at Arthur's sternum. Arthur stared up at the descending blade, his vision blurring. He pushed up with his hands, desperately trying to catch the man's forearms, but his strength was completely gone. His muscles were burning, failing. I'm going to die here, Arthur thought, a cold, numb horror washing over him. I'm going to be slaughtered in my own hallway. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the terror hit Arthur's nervous system like a power surge. His brain, already completely frayed from weeks of severe sleep deprivation and relentless psychological stress, simply overloaded. The defense mechanism triggered. It wasn't hypnagogic paralysis this time. It was a severe, trauma-induced cataplectic strike, a terrifying symptom of narcolepsy brought on by extreme emotional distress. In a fraction of a second, the neural pathways bridging Arthur's brain to his voluntary muscles severed completely. Arthur's arms, which had been reaching up to block the knife, instantly went completely limp, dropping to the floor with a heavy, dead thud. His jaw slacked. His torso went completely rigid. He was paralyzed. Fully, entirely paralyzed, wide awake, pinned to the floor by a murderer. He could only stare straight up, his eyes locked open, unable to blink, unable to scream, unable to even twitch a finger. The intruder paused. The knife hovered in the air, trembling slightly. The man looked down at Arthur's sudden, corpse-like stillness, his manic expression faltering into confusion. What are you doing?" the man whispered, panting heavily. "Stop faking. Stop it." He adjusted his grip on the knife, preparing to plunge it downward. But as Arthur lay there, locked in his flesh prison, the familiar, terrible sensation began. It started at the base of his skull, a low, vibrational hum that quickly escalated into a deafening, metallic shriek. The static tore through Arthur's mind, louder than it had ever been. Then, the physics of the hallway simply broke. The ambient temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted with catastrophic speed. Within seconds, the air turned to freezing, biting winter. The moisture in the humid summer air instantly crystallized. A layer of thin, white frost began to spiderweb rapidly across the wooden walls, the floorboards, and the brass fixtures of the hallway sconces. The sharp, cracking sound of freezing wood echoed through the space. The intruder gasped, his breath suddenly erupting into thick, white plumes of vapor. He froze, the knife still suspended in the air. He began to shiver violently, his thin, ragged clothes offering no protection against the supernatural sub-zero drop. "No," the man whimpered, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he looked away from Arthur and stared down the hallway toward the bedroom door. "No, no, no." Arthur couldn't turn his head to see what the man was looking at, but he didn't need to. The smell hit him, a massive, suffocating wave of ozone, charred wood, and damp, ancient earth. It was so potent it tasted metallic on the back of his tongue. The ambient light in the hallway began to die. It didn't just fade, it was actively consumed, drawn into a single, terrifying locus point. From Arthur's peripheral vision, shadows began to stretch and distort, pulled toward a massive, coalescing mass of pure void at the end of the hall. The night watchman had not been summoned by a dream. It had ripped itself into the waking world, anchored by Arthur's paralyzed state, responding to the ultimate threat against its ward. SCHHHHK. 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 The sound of bare, unnatural flesh dragging against the frosted floorboards echoed loudly. The entity was moving fast. It wasn't gliding slowly as it did in the bedroom, it was rushing forward with a violent, jutting, frame-skipping fury that defied visual comprehension. The intruder screamed a high, piercing shriek of absolute, mind-shattering terror. He scrambled backward, completely forgetting about Arthur, the knife slipping from his frozen, trembling fingers and clattering harmlessly onto the hardwood floor. The man scrambled on his hands and knees, scrambling backward toward the top of the stairs, his eyes fixed on the towering, 10-foot mass of swirling, freezing darkness bearing down on him. The entity eclipsed the hallway. The temperature dropped so low that the plastic casing of the nearby smoke detector cracked audibly. The watchman loomed over the pathetic, crawling form of the intruder. Arthur, completely paralyzed, could only watch the edges of the confrontation. He saw the entity's impossibly long, skeletal arms extend. The hand with too many jagged, spider-like fingers reached out, not toward Arthur, but toward the man who had tried to kill him. The demon didn't strike the man physically. It simply reached out and placed one massive, freezing hand over the intruder's face. The intruder's screams were cut off instantly, muffled beneath the void. His body went completely rigid, locking up just as Arthur's had. For 3 agonizing seconds, the man thrashed against the floorboards, his heels drumming a frantic rhythm, his eyes rolling back in his head as he was forced to stare directly into the abyss of the entity's faceless visage. Whatever horrific, mind-bending terror the demon forced into the man's psyche, it broke him completely. The entity removed its hand. The intruder didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply curled into a tight, pathetic fetal ball at the top of the stairs, whimpering, a continuous, broken string of nonsense syllables bubbling from his mouth. His mind was entirely, irreversibly shattered. The crushing, freezing aura in the hallway held for a moment longer. The thick black static roared in Arthur's ears. Then, the watchman slowly turned its massive bulk away from the broken man on the floor. It glided back toward where Arthur lay paralyzed. The entity towered over Arthur, blocking out the ceiling entirely. It leaned down, its faceless void hovering mere inches from Arthur's paralyzed, terrified eyes. The intense cold radiated off it, chilling Arthur to the bone. Slowly, gently, the entity raised one long, jagged finger. It didn't scratch him. It didn't drag across his cheek. It simply pressed the freezing tip of its finger against Arthur's forehead. The static cut out with a loud snap. The paralysis shattered instantly. Arthur's body arched off the floor, a massive gasp tearing through his throat as control violently returned to his muscles. He rolled to the side, coughing and violently shivering, scrambling away from the center of the hallway. When he looked up, gasping for air, the hallway was empty. The supernatural frost was already beginning to melt, leaving wet streaks down the wallpaper. The temperature was rushing back to a stifling summer heat. The only sound in the house was the pathetic, low whimpering of the broken man curled into a ball at the top of the staircase, rocking himself back and forth. Arthur sat against the wall, his chest heaving, his hands trembling violently. He looked down at the floor, inches away from his knee. Sitting perfectly centered on the hardwood, right where the demon had been standing, was a final yellow sticky note. It was pristine, completely untouched by the dampness of the melting frost. Arthur reached out with a shaking hand and picked it up. Written in the familiar, aggressive charcoal scrawl were 2 words. "Call police." The piercing, oscillating wail of the police sirens shattered the suffocating silence of the old colonial house, slicing through the humid summer night like a physical blade. To Arthur, sitting on the bottom step of his front porch with his head buried in his hands, the sound was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He had managed to drag himself downstairs, his legs feeling like they were made of wet sand, and dial 911 with blood-stained, trembling fingers. He had barely been able to articulate the words to the dispatcher intruder, "Knife, upstairs, hurry," before dropping the phone and collapsing by the front door, waiting for the flashing lights. Now, the entire street was bathed in a chaotic, strobing wash of red and blue. Neighbors were peeking through their blinds, awakened by the commotion. 2 cruisers had jumped the curb, parking haphazardly on his front lawn. A paramedic with a stern, focused face was wrapping a thick orange shock blanket around Arthur's trembling shoulders, shining a harsh penlight into his dilated pupils to check for a concussion. Arthur barely registered the sting of the antiseptic wipes being dragged across the shallow, bleeding slice on his neck where the chef's knife had bitten into his skin. His mind was still trapped in the frozen, frost-covered hallway upstairs. "Blood pressure is through the roof, but you're going to be okay, buddy," the paramedic said softly, pressing a thick gauze pad against Arthur's neck. "You're safe now. They've got him." The heavy thud of combat boots echoing on the hardwood stairs inside the house drew Arthur's attention. He looked up, peering through the open front door. Two large patrol officers were half walking, half dragging the intruder down the stairs. The man who had been a terrifying, murderous predator only 20 minutes ago was now completely unrecognizable. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't fighting the handcuffs biting into his bony wrists. His legs dragged uselessly beneath him, his knees sagging with every step. His eyes were blown wide, completely unblinking, staring blankly at the ceiling. A continuous, wet string of drool hung from his slack jaw. And he was babbling. It wasn't speech, it was a fractured, looping loop of broken syllables and whimpers. As the officers hauled him through the front door and out onto the porch, passing within 3 feet of Arthur, the man's frantic whispers suddenly became coherent for just a terrifying second. The smoke, the black smoke, the man wept, his voice completely devoid of sanity, shaking his head violently as if trying to dislodge a parasite from his brain. So cold. Too many fingers. Don't let it touch me again. The dark is looking at me. It has no face but it's looking at me. All right, take it easy, pal. Keep moving, one of the officers grunted, easily pushing the emaciated, broken man toward the back of a squad car. Guy is absolutely out of his gourd on something. Meth, probably. Or bath salts. Brain is completely fried. Arthur pulled the orange shock blanket tighter around his shoulders, shivering despite the 80-degree heat. The officer thought it was drugs. The medical professionals would likely diagnose it as a severe, acute psychotic break brought on by malnutrition and the adrenaline of the attack. But Arthur knew the truth. He knew exactly what had shattered the man's mind into a million irreparable pieces. The watchman had shown the intruder whatever laid beyond the veil of the waking world, and the human brain simply wasn't equipped to process it. The entity hadn't just protected Arthur, it had completely neutralized the threat with a surgical, supernatural precision. An hour later, the street had calmed down. The ambulance had departed, leaving Arthur cleared of any life-threatening injuries. The street was cordoned off with bright yellow tape. A plainclothes detective named Miller, a stocky man with a graying mustache and weary eyes, walked out the front door. He pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket, sighed heavily, and sat down on the porch steps next to Arthur. He offered Arthur a lukewarm bottle of water. "Drink it," Miller said quietly. "Helps with the shock." Arthur unscrewed the cap with shaking hands and took a sip. Did you find where he came from?" Detective Miller rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking out at the dark street. "Yeah. We found it. Son, I've been on the force for 22 years, and I've seen some deeply unsettling things. But the setup upstairs." He trailed off, shaking his head. "He was living in your crawl space. The attic access above the guest bedroom closet." Arthur's stomach plummeted, a cold knot tightening in his gut. The moved keys. The missing food. The smell. He is already inside. How long? Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Based on the accumulation of waste," Miller said, choosing his words carefully to spare Arthur the more grotesque details, "and the dates scrawled in a rotting notebook we found up there, we estimate he's been living above your head for at least 2.5 months. 2.5 months. Arthur felt physically sick. He leaned forward, resting his forehead on his knees, trying to take deep breaths to stave off the rising nausea. "He had a whole nest carved out in the fiberglass insulation," Miller continued, his tone grim. "Sleeping bag made of your missing winter coats. Dozens of empty food wrappers. But that wasn't the worst part, Artie. The worst part was the vents." Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot and terrified. "The vents." "He carefully popped the grates off the HVAC vents leading down into your bedroom and your master bathroom," Miller explained, gesturing vaguely upward. "He drilled tiny, microscopic peepholes through the drywall right next to them. He had a perfect, top-down view of your bed. He's been watching you sleep every single night. The notebook we found, it chronicled your entire routine. When you brushed your teeth, when you turned off the lights, how often you tossed and turned. A violent shudder racked Arthur's body. The realization was suffocating. Every time he had laid in the dark, feeling vulnerable, feeling like he was being watched, he was. A deranged man had been hovering just 3 feet above his head, staring down at him through the floorboards. We also found a bottle of heavy-duty rat poison mixed with liquid drain cleaner, Miller added softly. We're going to test the food in your fridge, but I'm betting my pension he was slowly contaminating your groceries. Trying to make you weak. Trying to make it easy. Arthur thought of the thick, curdled milk in the sink. Don't drink the milk. Why did he attack tonight? Arthur asked, his voice hollow. If he was playing the long game, why come out with a knife? Miller frowned, looking back toward the open door of the house. That's the part we can't figure out. The hallway is a mess. There's a section of floorboards completely frozen over burst pipe in the wall, maybe, freon leak from the AC, we'll have forensics look at it. But the guy's ravings, he kept screaming about a shadow. About you having a guard dog made of smoke that was ruining his plans. Said the guard kept locking the doors he opened and moving things around. The guy was deeply schizophrenic. Whatever hallucination he was having, it spooked him into acting prematurely. Arthur looked down at his hands. He didn't say a word about the sticky notes. He didn't mention the towering, freezing entity with the spider leg fingers. He just nodded slowly, letting the detective construct a rational, acceptable reality out of the supernatural chaos. You're a lucky man, Arthur, Miller said, patting him awkwardly on the shoulder before standing up. A very, very lucky man. No, Arthur thought, looking up at the dark window of his second-floor bedroom. Not lucky. Guarded. 6 weeks later, the blistering heat of the summer finally broke, giving way to the crisp, cool breezes of early autumn. The leaves on the old oak tree in the backyard were turning a brittle, fiery orange. But Arthur wouldn't be around to see them fall. He was in the middle of packing up his life. He had broken his lease, forfeiting his security deposit without a second thought, and rented a sleek, modern apartment on the 14th floor of a high-rise downtown. It was a concrete box in the sky. It had keycard access, a 24/7 concierge, and most importantly, it had absolutely no attics, no crawl spaces, and no hidden dark corners. The recovery process had been grueling. The physical cut on his neck had healed into a thin, pale pink scar, but the psychological wounds were much deeper. He had been seeing a trauma specialist, Dr. Eris, twice a week. What you experienced in the hallway, the sudden, total paralysis during the attack, is a documented medical phenomenon, Dr. Eris had explained to him during their third session, sitting in her bright, sunlit office. It's called cataplexy, often associated with narcolepsy. In moments of extreme, overwhelming emotional stress or terror, the brain basically short-circuits. It violently severs the connection to your voluntary muscles to protect the nervous system from overloading. You were conscious, but your body was locked in REM apnea. A survival mechanism, Arthur had replied, staring at a painting on her wall. Exactly, Dr. Eris smiled warmly. Your brain protected you. And the hallucinations of the cold, the shadows, that was your mind trying to process the trauma of the physical assault in real time. Arthur had simply nodded, accepting the clinical diagnosis. It was easier to let the doctors believe his brain had saved him. It kept him out of a psych ward. But Arthur knew that his brain hadn't dropped the ambient temperature of the hallway to sub-zero levels. His brain hadn't left a pristine, dry sticky note in the center of a puddle of melting frost that read "Call police." Since that night, the sleep paralysis had completely, utterly vanished. Arthur was sleeping 8 to 9 hours a night, a deep, restorative, dreamless slumber. He no longer dreaded the dark. The chronic stress, the low-level hum of anxiety that had plagued his life for months, had evaporated the moment the police hauled the intruder away. Without the constant, subconscious threat of the man living in the ceiling, Arthur's nervous system had finally reset. But with the fading of the threat came the fading of the protector. The night watchman never returned. There was no buzzing at the base of his skull. No freezing drops in temperature. No towering column of black smoke standing sentinel at the foot of his bed. The yellow sticky notes were a thing of the past. His nightstand remained empty, save for his water glass and his alarm clock. Arthur taped up a heavy cardboard box filled with architectural textbooks, the sharp rieep of the packing tape echoing loudly in the empty living room. He surveyed the space. It looked entirely different, stripped of his furniture and rugs. It just looked like an old, slightly run-down house. The sinister, expectant atmosphere that had choked the halls for months was completely gone. It was just wood, plaster, and glass. He carried the box out to the moving truck idling in the driveway, handing it off to one of the hired movers. "That all the downstairs stuff, boss?" the mover asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah, just the bedroom left," Arthur said, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans. "I'll go break down the bed frame. Give me 10 minutes. Arthur walked back into the house and climbed the stairs. He didn't hesitate at the top. He didn't look at the spot where the intruder had curled into a catatonic ball. He just walked straight into the master bedroom. The room was bare except for the heavy oak bed frame and the thick, memory foam mattress resting on top of it. Sunlight streamed through the unobstructed windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur grabbed the edge of the heavy mattress, intending to slide it off the wooden slats of the frame so he could unscrew the headboard. He braced his legs and heaved, pushing the massive mattress sideways. It slid with a heavy, scraping sound, hanging halfway off the frame. Arthur paused, reaching for his cordless drill on the windowsill. As he turned back toward the bed, something caught his eye. Resting on the wooden slats, exactly in the center of the bed, directly beneath where Arthur's chest would have been while he slept, was a small square of bright yellow paper. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. The drill hung loosely in his hand. The silence of the empty house suddenly felt immensely heavy, pressing in on his eardrums. He slowly walked over to the bed frame. The sticky note was worn. The edges were slightly curled, and the paper was indented from the sheer weight of the mattress pressing down on it for the past 6 weeks. It hadn't been written recently, it had been left there on the very last night, hidden away, waiting for the day Arthur finally packed up to leave. Arthur reached out. His hand wasn't trembling with fear anymore. It was trembling with a strange, overwhelming sense of reverence. He picked up the small square of paper. The writing wasn't the jagged, furious, paper-tearing scrawl of a frantic warning. The thick, black charcoal had been applied gently, with a careful, deliberate slowness. The letters were neat, almost soft, smudged slightly by time and pressure. There were only 4 words, written in the center of the yellow square. "You're safe now. Goodbye." Arthur stood in the quiet, sunlit bedroom, staring at the note. He traced the smooth charcoal line of the word goodbye with his thumb. A lump formed in his throat, thick and unexpected. A profound, sweeping wave of emotion washed over him, a complex cocktail of relief, lingering trauma, and a bizarre, undeniable pang of grief. He had spent months terrified of the monster under his bed, only to discover that the true horror of the world wore a human face. The towering shadow, the freezing void, the impossible, many-fingered hands, it had all been a terrifying armor, a supernatural shield forged by the universe to stand between Arthur and the waking nightmare hiding in his walls. The night watchman hadn't been a demon sent to torment him. It had been a guardian. And now that its watch was over, it had quietly slipped back into the dark, returning to whatever incomprehensible realm it had crawled out of. Arthur slowly folded the sticky note in half, perfectly aligning the yellow edges. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and tucked the small piece of paper safely inside, pressing his hand against the fabric to ensure it was secure. He took one final look around the empty bedroom. He looked at the closet doors, now just harmless wood. He looked at the corner where the shadows used to gather, now brightly illuminated by the afternoon sun. "Thank you," Arthur whispered to the empty room. His voice was steady, carrying through the quiet stillness of the house. "Thank you for everything." There was no answer. No sudden drop in temperature. No static buzzing in his ears. There was only the gentle rustle of the autumn wind through the oak tree outside, and the distant, muffled sound of the movers waiting by the truck. Arthur smiled, a small, genuine expression of peace. He picked up his drill, engaged the battery, and began to take apart the bed. He was finally ready to go home.